manage wildlife, but they also then share and partner that with state wildlife agencies. And so that would be a great question to specify to ask BLM. Yeah. But I think that was just congressional authority that they gave to them because the wild and feral horses aren't deemed a wildlife. So.
Right. Yeah.
That's outside my wheelhouse a little bit. So.
No, it's helpful. Thanks. I mean, there's a lot of nuance among the federal agencies in terms of, there's the large scope of authority that, is sort of the obvious one that agencies have, but then there are these sub divisions within a lot of federal agencies that people are less aware of. And so, for example, I mean, Fish and Wildlife Service is all about, like you said, the species side of it, but on the refuge side of Fish and Wildlife Service, they are land managers as well. And so, it's a little nuanced because people think, oh, land managers, they're BLM and Forest Service. But anyway, there's just a lot of kind of step downs within federal agencies that people are aware of.
I think the short side of, I guess the story is Wildlife Services, when it started in the early 1900s, part of Biological Survey was Secretary of Agriculture and others looked at, hey, we have some conflicts, and this was primarily at the time was rodents and agriculture. And so they wanted to do a study. Can we do something about that? And so that initiated many, specific studies and seeing could they feasibly implement a program? And the end result was, yes, they could, and it expanded to other species. And so it became an agency specialized with a niche of helping to resolve conflicts. Other agencies with various other aspects of their authorities, managing resources, managing wildlife, and having Wildlife Services kind of be that the federal partner that helps provide that leadership and that little niche in addressing conflicts.
Yeah, interesting. Hi, Joe. Hi, Tyler.
Howdy.
Hey, Kevin. Kevin Blakely. Thanks, because we've been having a nice conversation with Kevin Christensen about the sort of the role and history of APHIS. Hey, Shannon. Hi, Amy. Here's a question for you, Shannon, since Kevin brought it up and we're waiting for people to join. Okay, that's fine, Sam. Thanks for the heads up. Did State Fish and Wildlife Service ever have a kind of a similar role that APHIS has at the federal level? Because Kevin was saying that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service used to have APHIS, and then now it's under USDA. Did state ever have a role like them?
I feel like I'm still missing a piece. I think I get the gist of like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, kind of had a focus on species conservation, and then became a side group around, best management practices for predator control and things like that, which wasn't intended. And I think it's different for state. I think we've always had this role of managing wildlife species, whatever their definitions. So we've never kind of had this offshoot or later a look at that role, but it definitely has, similar to their, look at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service versus USDA's authorities. We've certainly seen our authorities move back and forth with ODA. Oregon Department of Ag.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Unless Kevin Blakely's history goes back further in mine and he thinks differently.
No, I'd say that's exactly right. The agency, even when we get money now, it comes from legislature, and we hire the professionals with that money to do work, both from ag and our side. In the history of the agency, back in the Game Commission, we did all that control work, at the district level in response to damage, whether that was coyotes, raccoons, it kind of was incumbent upon that district biologist, but it wasn't at the level that is undertaken now with agriculture.
Right. That's interesting. That would make sense that it would happen at the district level.
Yeah, and we've never gotten a, any other kind of fund allocation to the agency to do that until we had that kind of contractual agreement for both agriculture, state agriculture and state fish and wildlife to do that with USDA.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other big connect for all the states is through OFWA. So through that connection, that brings in a lot of the collaborators, whether it's USGS, Wildlife Services, all that, both technical and field expertise along to the states with their projects.
And OFWA is just it's the federal wildlife agencies, right? There's not like a NGO aspect to it.
No, the OFWA is the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies.
Right.
That's the state.
Okay.
Yep, the state fish and wildlife agencies.
That's right.
Yeah, and they function as both a collaborative working group for the states as well as the kind of the lobbyist branch for, state jurisdictions and that to be able to influence federal legislation without the states doing that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hey, Jim.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Okay.
Is it raining out there?
Nope.
Not yet?
Nope.
Are you expecting any rain?
Nope.
Oh, that's too bad. Western Oregon's getting some here in the next couple days.
I wish we had some. We
I
need
know. So I was curious. I was wondering about you.
Not
Hey,
in-
Derek.
Afternoon.
Hey, Quinn.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Kelly. Oh, I said hi and she disappeared.
Jamie, Marianne is going to jump over at, I think she can be here at 3, which is handy because that's when I have to leave. So
Oh, okay. So you're going to do a baton handoff.
yeah,
Huh?
like a WWE match, the tag she's in.
That's exactly the image that I had in mind as well. Now I can never think of you and Marianne.
But like Ultimate Warrior era, not, like.
No, it's too late, Kyle.
Yeah.
The image is in my head.
Perfect.
All right, Kelly. So those 3 little dogs in your picture, are they all siblings? Is it a mom and pup?
No. I adopted them all.
They all look like they're the same dog practically.
There's a theme. I do like those scruffy terriers. I know. And they just keep getting smaller.
Kind of like nesting dolls. They just
Yeah. It's just, they find me. Yeah.
Hi, Bob.
Hello.
Hey, Jordan.
Hello.
That was very enthusiastic. Hello. Not faulting you at all, but it's, a lot of good energy for a Tuesday afternoon.
I try.
Hi, Stan.
Hi.
Who are we waiting for, Sam?
I think we are nearly there. I heard Marianne will be joining a little later. And then this is for Jordan. Is Lauren able to join us today?
I do not believe so, no.
Okay, great. I think she was the last person.
Okay. So just before we dive in, so Jordan, welcome. Jordan is with Association of Oregon Counties. Lauren was our rep from Association of Oregon Counties. She's taking a new position with the Farm Bureau. And so Jordan will be stepping in as the lead for Lauren. But for today's meeting, Jordan's going to be more of an observer as he's trying to understand everything we're talking about. Right, Jordan?
That's right. And as a long-term position, they are looking for a natural resources
lobbyist, because of course I am a policy analyst, which means that I like numbers and data structures. And they're looking for someone with just a little bit more social skills than that sort of person typically has. Not that I do a bad job, but we want to get someone who does a good job of really representing Oregon County's interests articulately. So
it may or may not be you in the long term.
that's the plan, yes.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us now. The other change that we have is Doug Nickel. Is that right, Jim? Did I say his name right? Nickel? He was Jim's alternate, and he can no longer be Jim's alternate. And so Jim has chosen Stan as his alternate. So Stan joins us as an alternate for the trappers. I think those are all the changes that I have. Okay, and so then just a reminder, for alternates, we ask that you stay muted, you're observers, you're listening, just like alternates for our Beaver work group. So with that, welcome everybody. I think we can go ahead and get started. So we're scheduled to go till 4 o'clock today. Hopefully everybody can stay. I know that Kyle will be leaving at 3 and Marianne will be replacing him in a baton handoff. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Just a few reminders. I already mentioned one. Everybody should stay on mute unless you're speaking. Alternates are here just to observe, and so they stay connected to the conversations. And if you have any technical difficulties, let Sam know. Her number is here on the screen. Go ahead and go to the next slide. We ask that you use your raise hand function. If you want to get in the queue for a conversation, you can also just raise your hand and we'll do our best to track all of that. You can use the chat to include information for everybody to know or to hear or understand. But we ask that you not have a parallel meeting going on in the chat because that makes it hard for everybody. So, and then I think everybody's named themselves, so that's good. And that's particularly helpful for our viewers. Welcome viewers, people who are watching the live stream of our Trap Check meeting. It's helpful for them to see everybody's names. So let's go ahead and go to our agenda. So one of the things we've learned from the several meetings we've had with all of you so far is that neither this group nor the Beaver work group does really well with a lot of items on the agenda. That we don't get enough time for conversation. We don't get enough time to ask our questions. The 2 hours seems like it flies by, and we end the meeting feeling frustrated because we haven't been able to, have the deeper conversation we want to have. So in light of that, we have one topic for today. And Jim, we've worked with Jim, talked with him a couple of times now. So he's all prepared, and we sent some information out that he asked us to share about best management practices for trapping and trapping technologies. And there was a video that he sent out, and best management practices set of documents from the mid-90s. And then there's a document, is it just White et al? What is the name of that document? The more 2000, the more recent set of best management practices. So those are the pieces that were sent out for folks to take a read and get more familiar with. But so today's meeting, we're going to take a pretty deep dive with Jim into trapping technology. So now, this is, and it's specifically through a fur-bearer lens, because Jim is a fur-bearer trapper. And so really looking at how trap technology has changed over time, different trap technology that's used, how trappers look at trapping through an animal welfare lens, how best management practices have evolved to address animal welfare concerns. So Jim has information to share with us, but it's really going to be a pretty deep dive into asking Jim questions to really understand and unpack all of these specifics around trap technology. And we gave Kevin a heads up. You'll see Kevin here from APHIS, and Derek has gotten a heads up as well that they are resources to help answer questions. They don't have prepared presentations for us today. We have heard from both of them at previous meetings. So, and then we have just a little loose end to tie up around the draft charter. If you recall at the last meeting, there were questions about game animals, and we met with commissioners and had that conversation, met with Shannon along with commissioners. And so we'll have some information to share about that. And I think there's like one other little item in the charter. And then just a few minutes to spend on the next meeting topics and moving from there. So that's our meeting for today. Any questions from anybody about how we're going to spend our time today? Okay, seeing none, let's remind ourselves about the meeting guidelines. Fully participate, balance speaking time, come prepared. Hopefully people have read the materials. Serve as a liaison back, participate in open and mutually respectful way. There are a lot of differences of opinions we have come to learn as this work group, and sometimes that can be challenging, but we ask that people listen and treat each other with respect and act in good faith. We're all here to try to do something better, good, different perhaps, and working on behalf of what the commission has asked you all to do. So acting in good faith. Next slide. Quinn, you have your hand up. What's up?
Oh, I just had a question for Jim during his presentation. I wanted to know his preference for holding questions till the end or asking questions as they come up. I know people have different feelings about that.
That's a good clarification.
You know, I've got kind of a short history of the BMPs. Why don't we just run through that first? You know, that isn't going to take long. And then I've got a trap here that we can look at. I'll try to show it on the screen, give people an idea of some of the modifications that have been going on for years by trappers.
Okay, so it sounds like hold questions until he's done with his prepared remarks, and then we'll have a dialogue with Jim. And then, like I said, Derek and Kevin are here as resources as well to answer questions, because Jim is really focused on more of the Furbearer side. And Kevin and Derek can speak a little bit more on any differences associated with trapping on the predator side. So, are we ready to go? Okay. So, and Jim, just one little tip. So I know that you're using your computer audio just like I do. And so make sure that you're like leaning in, because sometimes when you lean back a little bit, your voice fades a tad, and we want to hear everything you have to say.
All right, I'll do my best.
Okay.
Okay, and before I get started, you know, I will mention that in this talk, for people that, you know, are new or haven't read all the material, I talk about ISO, and that is International Organization for Standardization. So when you hear that, you'll know what's going on. Yeah, and begin with, you know, an international challenge to modern fur bear management came in 1991 with wild fur regulations by the European Union Commission. The regulation prohibited the use of foothold traps in some European countries, and it also prohibited importation of wild fur from those same countries. And this created a threat to North American wild fur as well. And there was a kind of a couple of issues that developed here. One being that there are no agreed upon humane trapping standards. And another issue that came up was that international treaties and trade agreements are negotiated at the federal level in the United States, but the management authority for wildlife resides with the states and tribes. Now, as a result, based on the proposed ISO testing standards, the European Union, Canada, Russia, and the United States negotiated the agreement on international humane trapping standards. However, the US did not sign this agreement because the constitutional issue related to autonomous state and tribal management authority for resident wildlife. Instead, the US reached an agreement with the European Union to develop these BMPs for each of the 23 species of North American furbearers. Responsibility for the BMPs went to the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and as a result, they formed the Furbearer Conservation Technical Work Group to complete the task. Objectives for the trapping BMP program were to evaluate the performance of traps using standardizations, science-based national scale multiple species testing program, to stimulate continued development of improved trapping systems with respect to animal welfare, efficiency, and selectivity of traps, and also to develop BMPs and encourage use of BMP compliant devices by trap users, and to meet the United States obligations pursuant to the agreements with the European Union. And lastly, to provide effective outreach to better demonstrate and maintain trapping as a sustainable use of natural resources and an important tool for wildlife research and conservation and human-wildlife conflict resolution. The groundwork for collecting specimens for examination was done in teams of two, a trapper who had the experience to set the traps and make the catches, and a technician to record all the necessary data. Now, each specimen was then frozen and sent to the labs where a wildlife veterinary pathologist did a comprehensive full body postmortem examination to determine any trap related injuries. The parameters looked at to consider BMP compliance were animal welfare, efficiency, selectivity, practicality, and safety. Now, I'm sure everybody is most interested in the animal welfare issue here. And to consider animal welfare, there were two scales that were used. Both of them were approved by ISO to evaluate animal welfare. One scale used a cumulative point system, assigning a value for each possible injury from 0 to 100. The second scale looked at injuries and classified them as either none, mild, moderate, moderately severe, or severe. To pass compliance, 70% of each sample group had to have a cumulative score of less than 55 in the first scale and a rating of either none, mild, or moderate in the second scale. Now, as far as efficiency goes, for a trap to be considered efficient, it had to catch and hold greater than 60% of the target animals, which activated the trap. Selectivity kind of deals more with the trap, as it relates to the target animal, and also some considerations for ways to exclude non-target animals. No thresholds were ever established for selectivity in the BMPs. As far as practicality and safety, they were kind of considerations for the trapper, and there was no restraining devices that were excluded from these BMPs for these reasons. Now, in addition to standard restraining traps, mechanical powered killing traps, encapsulating traps, cage traps were tested as well and approved. And, basically we can't talk about the BMPs without talking about the trap modifications that have been going on for years. And nearly all these modifications were ideas for improvement that were developed by trappers. Modifications include laminations, center swiveling, reinforced base plate, added springs, and adding a shock spring. And a lot of the trappers now are modifying their traps, and manufacturers now are building traps which are incorporating these modifications. Kind of in this part of it by a quote from the research paper. And it states, it is our view, similar to position statements from the Wildlife Society and American Association of Wildlife Veterinarians, that traps and regulated trapping programs provide personal and cultural rewards and also facilitate or translate to conservation support and can assist with advancing ecological knowledge, protecting endangered species, restoring population habitats, protecting personal property, and enhancing public health and safety. And with that, yes, we kind of get into trap modifications if there's no questions to begin with.
How about Jim? Why don't we pause before we jump into the actual demonstration of the modifications and see what questions people have about the history that you just shared? Does that make sense?
Yep, that's good.
Okay. So what questions do people have for Jim about the evolution of where we are today with best management practices based on what he shared? Jill?
Yeah, I just have a question. So you said that the best management practices were established and traps were modified based on these examinations. Is that correct?
Well, no. They used a lot of the standard traps that did not have modifications as well.
Okay.
They did use some traps that were modified, but they also used a lot of traps that were not modified in any way.
Okay, and but you said all the traps were approved?
Not all of them. I don't have a list of those that were not approved. But instead of what they did was, instead of saying that this particular trap was approved or not approved, it gave the kind of the circumstances of the trap, the qualifications of it, and it traps that were like those traps would be approved, as well as those traps that that met the compliance.
Oh, okay. And then as trappers are modifying them, are they looking at the BMPs as they're modifying them, or even trying to make them more I guess, protective?
Well, to some degree, but a lot of trappers are just looking at ways, to improve animal welfare. I mean, none of us, want to hurt any animal more than is necessary. And trappers for years have done all kinds of things, developed different kinds of traps and done these modifications. Some of them before the BMPs. It's just something that's in our best interest.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions for Jim about sort of the history and the evolution of the best management practices and where we are today? He shared a lot of information about the evolution and kind of who's got authority and okay, I'm not seeing any, Jim. Talk to us about the trap the trap technology.
All right, I don't know. We'll see how this works here, but this is it. Well, if I get back a little bit, this is one of my traps that I've used this trap for, I don't know, probably 40 years. Now, as far as the modifications go, well, first of all, you can see there's a gap in this trap right here. That's a requirement for a number 3 trap, which this is. Now, when I bought this trap, it did not have this gap in it. What I did was, and probably can't see right, can you see that? There's a weld right there. I stuck a weld on the edge of that trap so that it does not let that trap close all the way. I've done that on both sides. There's another weld right there. And that ensures that 3/16 gap in the trap. The second thing I did, this right here is a piece of 3/16 round stock. And on both sides of these traps, I've welded that round stock on there. What that does, that just, that gives you about double the thickness of the jaw there. And it just kind of just distributes the pressure a little bit for the trap animal. And I like this round piece on here. That just kind of makes it more comfortable for the animal and reduces any possible cutting on the animal's foot. That is probably one of the best things. It's the second best thing I like about this. What I've done to this trap is this is center swiveled. This is where the trap is attached now. When this trap, when I bought this trap years ago, this trap was attached here on this edge on this side. What I like about this center swiveling on this trap is when an animal gets in the trap, when it was attached on the side before, he would pull against the trap sideways. And if he slides across there, there's a possibility, of causing abrasion on his skin. But caught in the center like that and center swiveled right in the center, when he pulls, and maybe if I was out a little further, when he pulls on that trap, he's pulling from the center, and the trap, his foot's not going to move in that trap. It's going to hold right there. And the next thing I've done, there are, when this trap is attached at the end, there will be 6 points that this trap can swivel. And it'll move, round and around like that. Sometimes you'll get some grass caught up in here, and you'll kind of, you might get a swivel or two that's not working correctly. That's why I like more swivels in that trap. That's for the animal's comfort. Sometimes they'll roll in the trap, wrap the trap chain up without those swivels, and I'm just trying to reduce any possible injuries for this animal with these swivels. The other thing I do, and I don't think this has a lot of effect, but there is a shock spring at the end of my trap, and that's just in case if the animal makes a lunge, and that way he doesn't come hard against the trap. There's some give there, just kind of help them a little bit. This is a trap that I've also put a base plate on this trap. It's just a piece of 1/4 inch flat bar that I welded to the base. And that this trap, when I initially bought it, you probably can't see that where you are there, but it kind of had a thin base plate, and it would sometimes allow this base plate to bend a little bit. And years ago, everybody talked about 4-coiling these traps. And at one point I did 4-coil this trap. There was another set of coils on this side here, matching these coils here. But I found that I didn't really need that extra set of coils on there. Some people thought that helped in keeping the trapped animal in one spot, not letting him move or slide on the jaws. But I found, with center swiveling and everything, you don't need that extra set of coils unless you're working kind of in frozen ground situation where you have to break through frozen ground.
Hey, Jim, can I pause you just for a minute?
Yep.
And we've got a couple hands up, and then I know you've probably got more to share with us about the traps, but Bob, you had your hand up. You want to go ahead?
Sure, thank you. So Jim, I appreciate all the modifications that you're making to the traps. And forgive me if I missed something in the earlier part of your presentation, but it sounds like you're making all these changes. Are these things now BMPs that everyone's making these changes? Are they standard on newer traps, or are these things that you've decided are more humane and you're doing them, but they're not necessarily standard for the industry? I'm just trying to contextualize the changes that you're making sort of industry-wide.
Well, a lot of these are becoming more and more standard all the time. A lot of the newer traps being sold, incorporate a lot of these situations in their traps. What was the first part of your question? I'm sorry, Bob.
I'm just trying to understand whether these things are now standard. You're answering it, I think, but just whether these are recommended through the BMPs. This is something that everyone does, or it's kind of up to each individual trapper. Would you find these on a new trap? If I went and bought a trap today, would these things be pretty standard at this point?
Yes, you're going to pay a little bit more, for traps that have some of these modifications. But a lot of people are stepping up and buying, the newer traps now. So, I probably doubled the cost of my trap, by adding all this to it. But I started doing it probably 10 or 15 years ago, incorporating some and trying to see what worked best, for animal welfare, and done, tried different things at different times. And these are the things that I found that I feel make the animal a lot more comfortable.
Thanks. Appreciate the answer.
Thanks, Jim. Greg, you had your hand up next, and then Kelly.
Yeah. So Bob asked my exact question that I was going to ask. I think the only thing I would add on to that, I'm wondering, well, I guess it's hard to tell what percentage of traps that are out there have these sorts of modifications and which don't. I appreciate that you're doing that, Jim. You may be an exceptional person. Maybe those like you that have been trapping for 40 years and are using the same traps they've used for 40 years without any changes. So we just don't know. But I mean, hats off to you if you've done this to all of your traps. I mean, I'm just curious. I mean, how long is your average trap line? I mean, you're trapping, I assume, for fur, not just nuisance, right?
The length of my trap line, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, it depends. My coyote trap line is usually anywhere from 60 to 80 miles long.
Okay. And you've made this sort of modification on all those traps?
Yes. All my coyote traps have been modified this way.
Okay. You've had a busy welding shop. You've had a busy welding shop there. Okay. All right. Yep. Thanks, Jim.
You know, and I might add that, you know, on my small traps, I haven't modified my small traps, but nearly all my small traps I use in drowning situations. So I have not modified them, you know, like for muskrat or mink.
So
I haven't modified them because they're set so that the animal is dead within minutes.
So any water-based animal, water-based mink, otter, muskrat, so on, beaver. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Kelly?
Oh, yeah. Jim, thank you for this. Oh, I just found you. It keeps bubbling. I can tell you care. And I just wanted to preface this because then I want to just get to, and I appreciate this. I think for where we are, or where I am, is the one part that is inherent is the length of time an animal is in the trap, fully unrelated to any of the injuries. I guess I just wanted to put this out there, and just if you could talk about this, would be the length of time an animal is there exposed to the elements, aside from the injury or not in a trap. They have no access to water. They're fully exposed elements, predation, and there's stress. And so I think that's where it comes down to the length of time that an animal is in, whether it is a trap set for fur, for Furbearers, or in particular, those that are set for predatory animals, where there is 7 days that are allowed. So they would be in that modified trap for potentially 7 days on private property. So I just, yeah.
You know, you mentioned the 7 days. I'm a fur trapper.
No, and that's the thing is, Jim, I know, but we have Kevin here, you know, we have somebody else from you. Yes.
Yeah,
so
you're going to have to talk to Kevin about the 7-day trap.
but it is allowed at the state level. So it isn't really directed to you. We have Kevin here. I fully appreciate that. Yeah.
It's not allowed for people who are trapping for fur.
Correct. But there's quite a bit of trapping for damage.
You know, Kelly, you know, I appreciate where you're coming from, you know, and I understand that you care deeply for each and every animal out there. As a trapper, while you care for each and every animal, my concern is more for the population as a whole, you know, and so I'm willing, you know, to maybe hold these animals, you know, for a day or two, if I have to, you know, to control the populations, because you're not doing these animals any good if you do not control the population. You're actually hurting them, and there's actually it's less humane. And these animals don't die of old age. Very, very few animals ever die of old age in the wild populations. You know, they're dying of disease, predation, starvation, you know. So by controlling the population, in my estimation, it's more humane that way. So,
Yeah. I guess I would just say other states are likely, the trappers are following the best management practices as well. They might be modifying their traps or they're purchasing new ones, which are more costly. And there are still, you know, like 35 states that are trapping the inherent part. They're like, okay, we've got these traps that are about animal welfare. We're trying to have technology that minimizes injury. And then they don't stop there. They're like, and also we should minimize the time that an animal is in a trap. And I respect that in those states. And I guess that's just what I'm getting at is there's the type of trap and then there's the length of time that I believe is twofold. And I appreciate that we just might disagree on this. And but I know the other question about predatory animals is probably directed to wildlife services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, and the time, I mean, that's the central question to why this group exists. And so I remember, you know, talking with the trappers in the last couple of weeks and talking with our, you know, the environmental folks in the last couple of weeks, and people saying, when are we going to talk about the time? And so I think that we are trying to get at that, you know, but if you start backing up from the time, it's really, you know, trying to understand, you know, what are all of the, you know, what are the day-to-day practices around what they're trying to do, and how does time play into that? And I think that's, so we're trying to make that bigger picture. So Bob, you had your hand up. You're muted, Bob.
Sorry, Jim, I just wanted to follow up on the last comment. And you know, when I think of fur bearing trapping, I think mostly of sort of an economic activity and a recreational activity, but you were just making more of a wildlife management, population control argument about it. And I'm wondering if you can talk just a little bit more about that, because I don't really think in most cases of it being that, or being really designed to accomplish that. And you know, maybe I'm missing part of that, but can you talk a little more in terms of how that fits into kind of a population management regime?
just the management control of them, of the fur bearers. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Well,
because you mentioned, Jim, about disease, predation, starvation, and that trapping is a tool that to help manage populations, and that yes, some animals, you know, will die in that process, but you're thinking of a larger population.
Yeah, well, you know, when you don't control the animals out there, I'll give you an example. You know, here about I can't remember exactly when it was. It was 2000, a little after 2000. The market for coyotes went way down. I mean, they were, you know, $12, $15. You know, you couldn't make any money at all trapping coyotes. A lot of people kind of quit, backed off. Population started going higher. And in this area, mange got into the coyotes. When you have an increased population like that, its diseases get passed around a lot quicker. I pulled up to a trap one time, and I'm totally serious and honest here. I looked out there and I could see that I had something in the trap, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And I mean, this is in the winter, it's cold. I started walking out there, and I couldn't figure out what it was. I got probably within 10 feet before I recognized that it was a coyote that had mange. And that poor animal had almost no hair. He had a little bit of hair, you know, on his lower legs and the tip of his tail. And he was emaciated. It was one of the saddest things that I've ever seen. to be honest with you. And that's the kind of thing you get if you don't control these populations. I mean, and there's other diseases out there. I'm dealing with muskrats right now with tularemia. So, you gotta control them, for their benefit, as well as ours.
Quinn?
Yeah, I have a question getting back to the question about the intervals between trap checks. And this is probably, Derek and Kevin question, and thank you, by the way, for sending all the information. It was really helpful to look through those informations and just see how detailed it gets, especially when you get into those species specific guidelines. Really fascinating. So in looking through the White study, I was looking for, okay, so where's the guidance on intervals here, right? And there's a couple of pieces that I just want to get, feedback from the agencies on. So the study says, and I'm reading now from page 43, I think, we used daily trap checks to standardize testing because, one, they are required for live restraining traps in approximately 70% of states. And two, testing multiple protocols was not feasible on this large scale effort. So it goes on then to explain some of the difficulties around intervals. I mean, again, testing multiple intervals was challenging there. They talk about cautioning against drawing a correlation between increased injury with time spent in the traps. Some of the things that you all have explained to us, that for example, a 48-hour trap check requirement doesn't mean the animal spent 48 hours in that trap. Nonetheless, later on in the same study, it says, we caution against generalizations regarding the effect that extended trap check intervals have on injury scores, especially when projecting across states in different regions of the country. Conversely, we also stress that our trap check performance results are contingent on the daily trap check intervals used in the study and should not be assumed to apply to other intervals. Additional research would be needed to test such an assumption. So I guess, in looking through, I just didn't see much about trap check time intervals. And, given that this study has been relied on so heavily in this work group, I'm curious, Derek and Kevin, how you respond to that and how we're supposed to use this information about, injury and whatnot when it is based on a daily trap check. Sorry, I know that was a word salad.
I see Derek is unmuted, so go ahead, Derek.
Well, I guess I think it's kind of difficult to answer the question of why or how are we trying to use this BMP monograph to try and provide direct insight on what trap check intervals should be, primarily because BMPs are not designed to examine trap check times. BMPs are designed to evaluate traps and trap styles and how they operate and what species they are targeting. So the best, if this were a work group on what types of traps should we allow or what types of traps should be permitted for particular species, the BMP work would be perfect for that. So so I guess it's a bit of there's a little bit of a disconnect between what BMPs are and then this trap check time interval, which indeed, yes, you can take into consideration some of the shortcomings. And I also want to point out that, this monograph is a monster, and knowing that where it started and how it ended, as you notice in this publication, there's basically nothing about kill traps. This monograph is pretty much all about restraining traps, yet kill traps are indeed a part of the BMP program, and there's an enormous amount of information on that as well. So even there, it's like, be careful, this monograph isn't even conclusive of what really the BMP program is, but it is nonetheless a fantastic resource for explaining to you what the live trap situations are, how they get evaluated, what the history is, et cetera. So in many cases, that interval indeed is the kind of smallest unit of measure. And really, it's more so driven at the scientific approach of trying to make sure that this is a truly scientific investigation where they can actually analyze the results. Otherwise, if they let all of those various regulations come into play, it would just be, it'd all fall apart. Nothing would be able to stand on its 2 feet when it comes to a statistical analysis. So again, it's kind of like they chose that for kind of a design, and less so like this is what they think they're trying to test, or this is the kind of the gold standard type of thing.
Right. And I really thank you for clarifying that. So I guess my question is, looking at this information, which is again, all really helpful, for my understanding, about the practices, but how should we use the BMPs to inform the question before us, which is evaluating the intervals? Like, how does that come into play?
So this is Shannon. I'm going to weigh in on this question because when we had a similar question when we saw the agenda weeks ago, like, how is this figuring into actually evaluating trap check times? I don't know that we have an answer for you other than, there was a need from the group to have this information and consider it as we go through this process.
Thank you.
So I guess a follow-up question then for Derek and Shannon and maybe Kevin is, and this could be for a next meeting or a future meeting, is there information that would be helpful for the group that focuses on kind of unpacking the trap check times that's more than, just what every state is doing? That would be helpful. And maybe, we could need to think about this.
I think some of this still circles back to how we got to where we were today. So all of the information that was rolled out in, I think, July, explaining, why each of these is being used, I think is kind of a helpful place to start, because we're not just starting from scratch. There's plenty of context to a lot of the details that I think we can bring in if we're trying to whittle down at a particular question. But it sounds like Shannon had something she wanted to weigh in on as well.
It was very similar. I think it helps build that baseline, but we do need to look at that context of where is it public land, is it private land that they're being trapped, and what's the purpose behind trapping. And so Jim is here today to talk about the recreational fur bearer aspect mainly, and then Kevin and Derek are here for the other aspects. And we had that at the last meeting, but at some point we really got to dive into the different trap check times and why they were set that way and whether they remain that way or change.
Greg?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I agree, Sharon. Shannon, that's the bottom line of why we're here. But I think that the safety or the efficacy of the trapping method does weigh into considering how long they stay in the traps. My language is not flowing out right now. So just getting back to the question, Jim, about trapping as a wildlife management tool. And so I just wanted to clarify, it sounds like you're saying that the trap, let's use coyotes for an example, that this is actually a compassion-based reasoning that you're doing this, and aside from whatever value you get from the pelt, it's not that, if you take more animals out, then there are fewer potentially animals that would be diseased that could infect other animals that you want to trap. I mean, it sounds like you care about diseased animals, and that's why this is considered a management tool.
Well, about all I can say is I always try to consider compassion when I'm trapping. I try to never set where I think there's going to be a dog or a cat caught. When I'm muskrat trapping, I will not set a muskrat trap, a foothold muskrat trap, where I can't anchor that trap so that muskrat will drown within minutes. If it's going to just be caught there and stay there, I'll either have to use a conibear killing trap, and if that won't work, I won't set the set. I'll go somewhere else and set it where that animal is going to drown within minutes. So compassion is a part of it. I know you think I'm killing animals, and so I'm not compassionate, but when muskrat populations grow to a certain point, or in this valley, it's mostly irrigation ditches I'm trapping in. They dig into the ground, they dig around head gates, they drive the landowner crazy, and they want them out of there, and they're going to get them out of there one way or another. You might as well make use of the fur.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. I think probably a lot of people feel that just, populations naturally rise and fall, populations grow, disease can set in, takes more animals out, the population goes down. This has been going on for millennia before people ever existed. So, I think that those are probably Chris' question, why there needs to be human intervention to control disease, unless it really benefits people, because they would be dying anyway. So just bringing that up. Thanks, Jim.
Jill, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just want to say that what Jim is explaining is simply wildlife management, and of course our wildlife is very dependent on humans now, and they will at times, just like deer and elk, if we just let them go, they'd be overrunning fields and things like that. So we obviously hunting helps that, and also keeps them from getting diseases, and wolves help that too. So do cougars, for that matter. Having predators around is important as well. But so it's wildlife management these days, because people are in control of pretty much of what's going on in the environment, is pretty essential to keep the populations either down or healthy, or other things, because people don't want to see deer falling dead on their fields from diseases, or spreading them to their own wildlife. And trapping is just another management tool for the other species that aren't typically hunted. Just an example, here in our area, we had a lot of deer when we first moved here. And that's pretty typical of the Willamette Valley, because there's a lot of population, so it's hard to hunt here, or you have to hunt with a bow. And they wound up getting hair loss disease. And the fawns were walking around with, their hair falling out. And then a nearby neighbor had cherry trees, and so he got landowner preference tags, and that actually reduced the population, and the deer also got healthier. We don't see them with hair loss disease at all when we do see them, but there's a lot fewer deer as well. So it's all part of what we have to do these days, because of basically humans inhabiting the world in such high numbers and changing the environment. That's pretty much where I'm at with use of trapping as well as hunting.
Thanks, Joe. Tyler?
Yeah, thanks for all that. I think we're getting a little bit off topic. I think we're talking about why trapping is important here when really we should be talking about the BMPs and the interval question. I would just say that I think these BMPs are relevant because of these animal injuries, which I think go hand in hand with trap check interval. And I think that, we should stick to those kind of talking points. And I would just say that, I think there may be an opportunity here, or sorry, something just popped up on my screen, but I think there may be opportunity here to compare some further research with what they found in these BMPs. And I think that, like the concerns brought forward today is we don't have a lot to compare to what we're reading, right? Like, why are we reading this? It's not germane to the interval question, though I think it might be. And I think it's important that we realize that we may not be comparing apples to apples with what they found. It's still meaningful, and I think it's relevant to our conversation, but maybe we should be asking those sorts of questions. Like, how can we relate to what they're finding here? And really get at something quantifiable. I think that's the biggest reason that we're reading the BMPs is animal injuries are actually quantifiable. Our emotional responses to an animal being in a trap is not quantifiable. It's hard to have that discussion. But this is something that is concrete, and I think they've teed it up for us.
Thanks, Tyler. And the other part is, we are kind of struggling with how to have this conversation and have it be productive. The discussion has been trap check times need to, they need to stay the same, they need to change. And so, if that's where we started, if that's all we're talking about, then we can go around and around. I think what we were trying to do is make sure that people had a solid foundation of understanding of how trapping has changed over time, how trapping is practiced now, the differences between fur bearer or predator. I don't know that we've gotten into a lot of detail about the difference on private and public lands. We've talked about that a little bit, but just to make sure that there's a common knowledge base about what we're talking about when we start to dive into the, why the intervals are the way they are and why they might need to change or stay the same. And so that's where that's what we're trying to get at. And so if there is other information that would be helpful for people to have that conversation, have people have a common understanding and foundation, we're open to, whatever that is. I think we're just trying to figure out how to get into this conversation so it can be productive. Tyler?
Yeah, the other reason why animal injuries are so germane to this conversation is that, an animal without injury is much more capable of surviving the elements for longer periods of time. So we're trying to do everything we can as trappers to minimize injury in the trap. These animals are equipped to live in the wild in the elements. And I think that by our efforts here, we can ensure that animals will be more comfortable in traps for longer periods of time. And Jim, you can tell me if you agree with that.
Yeah, I do. I agree.
So, Jim, was there more information that you wanted to share before we take it back out to the whole group and then see what questions people have maybe for Derek and Kevin?
I can't think of anything at this time.
Okay. Quinn, you had your hand up.
No, I just appreciated, Tyler drawing the, kind of bringing us back to the correlation, like, why are we talking about BMPs in this context? I think that's really helpful. And again, I guess, I'd be interested in hearing from Tyler and from others too, given that, the basis of so many of, the modern BMPs or this white study, given that it's based on a daily interval. And I know they selected that for, scientific consistency. Nonetheless, those numbers and those injury rates are based on a daily trap check. So how are we then to extrapolate what that would mean here in Oregon for our job?
Tyler?
I guess that was directed kind of at me.
Yeah, I think it was.
No, I agree. I think we've talked a bit about these other trap check intervals across other states, right? I don't believe that Oregon should just follow other states and what they do just because other states are doing them a certain way. But I do also believe that logistic constraints are different in our neck of the woods, right? And that's why so many other states have a 24-hour daily trap check. I don't really think it's so much of an animal welfare issue. It's just, it's really easy to check traps, east of the Mississippi, roads everywhere, flat terrain, logistics that Jim would get to better. But I do think that there, like I said, there's opportunity to analyze where we are currently at and compare that to the daily trap check interval and the data that came from the daily trap check interval analysis before we make any changes in haste.
Jim, was your hand up?
Yeah, it was. As far as these 24-hour trap checks, if fly over, if you've flown across the United States, you've seen the arid West. And when you hit the Missouri River, the habitat changes dramatically. And it's from that point east is where most of these 24-hour trap checks are. The habitat there, the animals per square mile is probably, I'm guessing, probably 3, maybe 4 times more animals per square mile when you get east of the Missouri River than it is west of the Missouri River. And so if you're gonna, I'm in Eastern Oregon, with more a drier climate than you have in the western part of the state. There's fewer animals, per square mile here. I have to cover more ground, to catch those animals. That's why I'm going 60 to 80 miles a day. You can't do the job a 24-hour check under those conditions, and if I go to a 24-hour trap check, well, the first thing it does, the more times you visit that trap, the less likely you are to catch an animal. So I'm doubling my cost because transportation cost is the majority of my cost. So 24-hour check, I have to double that cost, and I'm going to catch fewer animals because I'm there more often. If you walk to the set, every animal around knows you've done it. And they're less likely to get into that trap. And, I don't make any money at this. It's basically, kind of a break-in. There's years I do okay, but there's years I lose money too. But if I go to a 24-hour track check, I'm not going to be able to cover the ground that I cover. I'm going to have to ask these ranchers to pay me to trap because they want me to trap. They've got coyote problems and they want them thinned out. So what do? I go to them and ask them to start paying me. They aren't going to like that much, So, to me, this is just an attempt to put trappers out of business in the state. And we can't do it. We've given all we can. We're not going to go under go to a 24-hour trap check. We can't do it. That's my assessment.
So that's on the Furbearer side. What about on the predator side? I mean, just what are a lot of the considerations, Jim, that you listed out are, the logistics, the terrain, The transportation costs, human scent is more prevalent daily. You know, greater cost to ranchers or land managers if they have to pay trappers to offset those costs. So that's on the fur bearer side. But you know, what about on the predator side?
Well,
And I don't know.
I would, if Kevin is there, I would prefer that he might answer that one.
Thank you, Jim. No, that is a great question. I say there are a lot of parallels to what Jim just outlined. Jim described, you know, from an efficiency standpoint, every trapper, I say most trappers, every trapper, but sorry, let me just collect some thoughts, but let me connect that to even like the PMBs, the best management practices. They're looking at selectivity, efficiency, as well as limiting injury. Trappers are looking to fill their traps, and they need to do that as efficiently as possible. If a trap is not full, if it doesn't have anything caught, then they're spending more labor to run that trap until they do catch something. So there's a lot of parallels with the BMP guidance and the efforts in that research to look at efficiency as well as selectively. So from a cost standpoint, if Jim, as a fur bearer trapper or an private individual addressing damage, or for wildlife services, the more times that you're making to that trap is going to increase your cost. Like you said, your vehicle cost, those costs in getting there. It's a lot of hours involved when you're driving those distance. You've reduced the efficiency of that trap because you put your scent and your presence back into that area, causing a novel disturbance, which in a lot of cases will decrease the time or increase the time that you take for that trap to settle back down, for that your smells and everything to settle down where an animal would get caught. You're also then going to look at, when you're doing this from a damage perspective, talked about maybe in the eastern part of the state when your trap lines could be a very small geographic boundary. And you can have a lot of traps because there's higher density of animals. In other areas here in the western part of the states and in portions of like Eastern Oregon, where you're going to have fewer traps per square mile because there's fewer animals. So your travel time in between locations, you don't generally run just one contiguous trap line across the entire county. You may have to leapfrog to a bunch of different locations. From a wildlife services standpoint, when you're addressing damage, we're responding to a request. And that request could be in the bottom part of the county, or it could be in the top part of the county. And if you've been in Eastern Oregon enough, you know there's not a nice, linear roads connecting, dots. And so there's a lot of travel time involved in responding to specific requests for assistance. So there's a lot in that geography. There's a lot in the timing that drives a lot of those discussion points. A lot said and a lot of varied topics there. So I'm just going to pause to see if there's some clarifiers to that.
Kevin, thank you for speaking off the cuff like that. Really appreciate it. And that's one of the reasons why we were hoping that you'd be here as a resource. I see we've got a couple of hands raised, so let's pause and get to those hands. We've got Greg and then Bob.
Okay, so just as a reminder, those who weren't around, a few years ago when the commission was grappling with this, the main reasoning that we heard for not reducing the trap check time 24 hours was the terrain and the geography that trappers had to traverse in order to check their traps. And so that was really the only argument that came up that swayed the commission to not reduce those the trap check times at that time. And that was, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, something like that.
Okay, Bob?
Yeah, maybe I'm piggybacking on Greg's comment, but I agree. I mean, I think we need to tease out this terrain argument because that was also, I think, 10 years ago when Kelly and I were on the task force too, that came up a lot. And I think we really need to tease it out and think about other states that have also difficult terrain, but have more stringent trap check requirements, and what, if anything, makes Oregon different from those states. And two, whether the way we're doing trapping on those terrains is appropriate, whether people need smaller territories. And I would just note, as a organization that does wildlife rehabilitation, ODFW, from my experience, doesn't really take our economics into account when they regulate us. They're not very interested in that, and whether it's economically feasible to do it in the way that they demand. Typically, the focus is on what they think is in the best interest of the animals, and if we can't do it, we're told, then don't do it. And so I think we need to also think about, that kind of a standard, that if you can't do it in a way that is humane, then maybe we need to change the way we're doing it, or put more resources in so that people have smaller areas, or look for those kinds of solutions, as opposed to simply saying it's not feasible to make any changes.
Kelly?
Yeah, well, it's not fully related to Bob, but I wanted to clarify this one point. Kevin, you had mentioned, or we keep talking about disrupting the trap if you check it every 24 hours. My understanding is those trappers who are checking their traps 24 hours, they're not going directly to the trap. They're from a distance, they've got binoculars, and they're looking. There's ways to do that. I mean, trappers are doing that in 36 other states, and they're being effective. And Wildlife Services is adapting to 24 hours. So I'm curious, I guess, then what would be the roadblock here for Wildlife Services to do something like that for predatory animals when you're abiding by that in the other states?
You're asking Kevin that question, Kelly?
I am.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So let me just kind of, again, speaking off the cuff, collect a little bit of my thoughts. When looking at, again, selectivity, efficiency, and reducing injury, when we look at, when Wildlife Services, I say, when we set a trap, we're looking at our employee safety, right? They need to be able to do the job efficiently, effectively, and safely for themselves. We're certainly looking at, the safety and the welfare of the animals that we're targeting, any potential non-target animals. But part of that discussion is also then looking at the humane treatment of the animals that we're protecting. We're there setting the traps to protect a resource, to protect, livestock, protect pets, in some scenarios, protecting people. So just like the BMP research, which is really world renowned for the level of effort that has gone into for this research in the States, as it looks at alternatives and options, ways to equip, ways to implement, there's a host of things that go into individual selectivity at a site for what tool, what application. Well, the same goes into play as we look at all the resources that we're protecting. So when you're talking about humaneness, one of the things that we also are considering is animals have been lost. Animals have been maimed, but maybe not killed. They've been injured and have to be subsequently euthanized because of those injuries. Cows that have lost their calves during birthing. I mean, some very raw, nature is very raw in how it responds. So part of our determination, if we don't take a measurable effort to stop and prevent that from reoccurring and continuing to occur, we're going to allow a certain amount of inhumane actions to continue or to potentially continue. So I think it's much like a lot of emergency response, and you're looking at the level, and it's you have to be able to look at the individual moment and when you're setting a trap, and how frequently you're going to be able to get back to that trap. One, because the geography, the terrain, how many other damage complaints you might be working, but also about the efficiency. One of the things mentioned last time, I think during last call, the statistics or information that I received from Derek as far as, catch per interview effort and catch nights, one metrics to look at things. Traps don't get full every night. You don't catch an animal every night. And in fact, the numbers for coyotes, it takes a number of nights, statistically speaking, before you capture a coyote. So even on a trap set that goes more than 48 hours, more than 76 hours, on a trap check, doesn't mean that trap is always going to be full, on night one, and you're not checking it until day 4. And in a majority of the cases, a lot of our employees find that the animal in the trap, it looks fairly fresh. It's taken a while for that trap because of the terrain, because of waiting for that animal to come back to that area, or that animal might be trap wise. It might have already been trapped or around another trapped animal. And so it's much more keenly aware of the circumstances. And so it can be more phobic for getting captured. And so it takes multiple attempts for that animal, in this case, talk about a coyote, to approach a trap close enough to where then it can get caught. So when we look at a trap time interval, we're looking at a lot more to that discussion. It's not just the logistics and the timing. It's from an efficiency and from professional experience, how long is it going to take to capture that animal, given past experience? And trappers by nature, I will say, certainly from a recreational standpoint and a professional standpoint, if they're not learning and evolving, they're not a good trapper, because animals will outsmart them every day. And so they have to learn a lot. Every time they set a trap, they have to learn a lot about that individual trap and the animals that visit that trap by watching the signs. Observing a trap from a distance is easy to do that with binoculars in the right topography. So you don't have to approach the trap. But what you're not seeing is the animals that approach the trap but didn't get caught, or the fact that maybe a mouse dug on your trap and exposed the pan cover, and now nothing's going to step on it and get caught. Whether you had a recent rain and how packed down the dirt looks around the trap, and whether you actually need to set the trap off and rebed the trap to make sure that dirt is not going to be impeded because of that rain, that caking of the mud, the freeze thaws. So you can check from a distance, but that doesn't tell you a lot of needful information about that trap. It just tells you whether there's something there or not. But when you're trying to address a conflict, there's not a lot of room for what ifs and to wait and see, because there's going to be animals that are going to be attacked again and again. And we're trying to prevent that from occurring, which is why we often have to have a lot more on-site information about what's going on, whether the animal had come back, whether it didn't step in the trap, whether it stopped 4 feet from the trap. There's a lot of needful information. And so it's a complicated subject. So again, Kelly, I want to pause to make sure I started to get at least somewhere close to answering your question.
I think you answered. I feel like I understand the complexities. I am sure in many of the other states, Wildlife Services has had to grapple with that too. I am just, I guess I didn't feel like it was completely answered, but I also understand that we kind of put you on the spot and asking you didn't know these questions in advance, and I really didn't so I appreciate that. I just, yeah, I'll just leave it at that, Kevin.
So Kelly, if I could just maybe expand a little bit more now that you give me a chance to kind of rethink maybe what I missed. I appreciate that. Much like you look at recreational trapping, fur trapping from state to state, those states are different. And when you look at states from the perspective of damage management, states have different rules and categories for their species, and they're handled differently from state to state. And Wildlife Services, in the same vein, operates differently from state to state.
Right.
Some states that have 24 trap check may not have an active program that's similar to Oregon, and the way we respond through our cooperative agreements with the state, with counties, with entities. And so that might not be the same comparison. Some states might have a more ready resource through funding, and they utilize other tools more effectively because they have those resources available. And so, you look at a state like Montana, where they have grizzlies, they have wolves, they have a lot of species, and they have limitations on trap checks. And so they spend a lot more resources on arrow hunting that can be a selective tool because of how labor intensive the ground trapping becomes when you're working around species that you don't want to catch, and the frequency in which you have to go, and you're still covering a very expansive ground. So I think there's a lot of other factors that play into, and I appreciate Tyler kind of pointing out earlier, there's a lot of things that we can glean from like BNP studies. There's a lot of information we can glean from other states and what they're doing. But we also then have to be very selective about the application at a state level, and what some of those trade-offs are and why they're there.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. That is helpful. I guess I would just say, if there's damage and a trapper is responding to, there's an issue with the farmer, and it would just seem important to check the traps even from a distance 24 hours, so that if there's multiple animals, offending animals, you can promptly get to the trap, release that animal, or kill that animal and reset the trap. And that is the importance, it seems, also of 24-hour trap check times when you're trapping for damage.
So Kelly, another good point, and I appreciate you kind of recognizing that value. One of the things when we're often working in damage situations, protecting livestock in particular, we have landowners, resource owners that, manage their livestock. They're on the landscape. They're regular to monitoring, especially during those calving and lambing seasons that are critical to them. So they have a lot of time spent. I mean, they're land resource stewards. They spend a lot of time on the ground and making observations. So in addition to our efforts, we have additional eyes and ears on the ground. So we may not be there checking that trap in that first day, that first night, but we have eyes and ears that are often there that will inform us when an animal is captured. And so that's something that's not been taken into consideration as well, is there's often in a lot of these cases an additional individuals that are helping with that. Albeit it may not be us directly, but that's why we're also not relying upon that as a sole source, because they may or may not be focused on looking at that trap to see whether it was off or not, but they're certainly aware enough when there's an animal in it. And we often do get those phone calls and are able to, then prioritize and get there quickly so that we can address that. And I think that's honestly part of those process when we just consider where we're setting our traps and why in cases we can see ourselves going longer. Knowing from our history how long sometimes it takes in those areas for animals to come back to the traps. Knowing that we're also going to have additional individuals that are working the land that also will be helping to monitor. Someone else had a hand up, I think.
Bob had his hand up, but it's down now.
Yeah, I took it down. I'm good. Thanks.
So if I can summarize, so we're at 3:30, and this has been a good conversation to start diving in. And what I want to make sure that we do is tee up what are the issues that we want to unpack. I like what you said, Bob, about, let's try to get underneath, what are the barriers to looking at different trap check times. I hear what Jim said, that, the concern among the trappers is, there's logistics, there's transportation costs, there's the human, the human aspect to it, there's the geography, there's additional costs to the land managers if they need to, pay trappers to offset. And then, Kevin, on your side, you added to that list about, efficiency and safety, for your, for the trappers. And so that's kind of the criteria around which the current program has been built, and I'm sure I've missed some things, but in order to understand, if there needs to be any change at all, which, to Jim's point, because I see Jim bristling already, is that, Jim has said, the trappers are concerned that this is just a way to stop trapping altogether. And I will say that among at least this work group, I have not heard that in this group. What I'm hearing from this group is we want to understand what the barriers are to to why we can't have different trap check times in Oregon. If other states are having it, if APHIS is responding in other states, and if there's some options about how we can increase more humane trapping, meaning animals aren't in there for as long, or trap technology is such that it minimizes damage. So I'm hearing there's a lot of interest around, there's a lot of commonality about, we don't want animals to languish. And, if there are barriers, we want to figure out what those are so that this group can make some recommendation to address those. And so if, for example, one of the barriers is, as Kevin was saying, that, if there's, lack of resources, let's just put that one out there, that, there's one person for a very large county covering a really large area, responding to damage, and predator concerns, from one end to the other, what are our options to help address that? So that's just one example I'll put out there. Anyway, and so, and the other thing that occurs to me is listening to Kevin talk, and Kevin, I appreciate you speaking off the cuff as well, is, when you're talking about, all these sort of things that you need to check that binoculars can't check on a trap. In some ways, you're making a case for that, it actually would be better if we could look at them more often because we get this data. And so, again, if it gets back to staffing and resources, in order to be efficient and safe, and humane, kind of what are the things that we need to be talking about as a group to address those issues. So I'm just gonna pause there. I see Greg's got his hand up. And then of those things that I've talked about around geography, resources, what was the other one? And then I had partnerships, because the other part, Kevin, you mentioned was partnerships with land managers, that in some cases, if we don't have the resources as a state or as a county, that we rely on the presence of other land managers who can, check a trap or alert us or whatever. And I don't know if data is being captured around that. But so those were the ones that I wrote down: geography, how APHIS is adapting to other states, what are the resource concerns, and the partnerships piece. Gosh, I wish I had a whiteboard and we were all in the same room. But so sit on all that for a moment. Greg, you had your hand up.
Yeah, and just a nuance to take that a little further, Jamie. So this relates to what Bob talked about of looking at other states, and then also Kevin and Jim talking about terrain and topography. So I agree. It should be apples and apples. And so I think about the West Coast, that we have the Cascade Range running through Oregon and Washington with valleys to the west of those. California, we have the Sierra Nevada mountains with a valley to the west of that. All three states have a dry or a xeric sort of environment to the east of those mountain ranges. So, challenging terrain. And so, I feel that we should, if we're going to do, I agree, don't look at Kentucky, Missouri, or don't look at Iowa, flat, not much varied terrain, very different situation. So I think if we do look at other states, I think it's worthwhile to look at the West Coast.
Thanks for that, Greg. Tyler?
Yeah, I think when we look at other states, though, there has to be something quantifiable so that we can all stand on something solid. And that's why the BMPs are so intriguing to me, is that this is concrete. And when we need apples to apples, I think we need data to stand on. For those need to be our apples. Data need to be our apples, not just what other states are doing. Unless there's something to learn from those other states that's empirical that we can take away from that.
I agree. Let's look at their data.
Marianne, welcome.
Thank you. I know, I'm sorry I'm late. Our board is meeting today, but Kyle sent me really excellent notes, more detailed notes than I would probably ever send him. So I am up to speed. Jamie, to the kind of 3 points that you outlined, I don't disagree that those are the right challenges to address. One of the things that I struggle with is, I do hear that there's not a desire to end trapping. And that's not kind of a goal. But at the same time, I feel like we've worked to get more support in all 3 of those areas legislatively, and have time and again been shot down by some of the very conservation groups on this call, or increased funding for wildlife services, more people on the ground that would enable them to do more of these kinds of practices. I think we're going to be really reticent to agree to some future, like, oh, let's all work together for more funding, or to have more people be able to check geographically more, or more support for landowners, when every single time we've gone to the legislature, even when we tried to tax ourselves to fund wildlife services, the conservation groups killed it. So I struggle with, I understand that here, maybe the notion isn't to end trapping, but when you say, more restrictive standards, but we will not ever support more funding or more resources or more personnel to help you meet that, it kind of leaves with ending trapping.
Thanks for that, Marianne. So of the, Derek, did you want to say something?
Well, that did just bring up a reminder to me that in the materials we sent out earlier for this process, through the years where all these trap check requirements were established, there was a pretty hefty economic analysis that was conducted regarding what various trap check times would mean. And I think it all came from Wildlife Services for the most part. I think OFIC might have contributed some content as well. But nonetheless, economics were indeed a pretty significant factor in some of that past decision making. So that is kind of related to that staffing, resources, needs to address conflict and financial loss associated with that. So that was just one thing I remembered from some of those past materials.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Derek. So thinking about the next meeting, so originally the idea for this meeting was to have kind of take a deep dive around trap check technology from a best management perspective and through an animal welfare lens, as well as look at animal welfare through a humane, like a veterinarian humane society lens. And what we decided was that was too much to have in one meeting. And as it is, we've had a really good conversation around basically the one set of topics. So we have a question in terms of which way we go for our next meeting. So for our next meeting, we could bring forward the animal welfare question, and people who can speak to that more directly. There's an interest among some folks in the group, and to have that happen. I go back to one of the issues that was brought up in our meeting today, which is, how does BMPs relate to the trap check time? How does the animal welfare piece relate to the trap check time? Should we just really be unpacking issues around the trap check times? And so I think we have a choice. So one is that we move forward with the folks who can speak from an animal welfare lens, and how does that help us inform the trap check conversation? I think that would be one topic. Another, a different choice would be to bring forward information around how the states that have different trap check times, how APHIS is addressing the geographic concerns, and what the resources are in those states to address the efficient, to address some of the issues we've raised here around the geography, around more frequency of how they're being checked, staffing, blah, blah, blah. Because Kevin, you had brought up that in some of those states, it isn't necessarily apples to apples, because there is more resources for other tools to be deployed, and or more resources for more staff, like Marianne was talking about. So I think those are two really different kinds of conversations to have. And I'm not suggesting we don't have either one. What I'm trying to figure out is which one we have next. So what thoughts do people have about that? Greg?
I just also wanted to know, if it was on the agenda today, we had our meeting with commissioners and with Shannon about the purpose of the group.
Yeah, that's the charter. That's the one
The
piece on the
charter
charter.
part?
Yeah,
Okay,
we
so
wanted
that's
to, we're
coming
going to
up.
get closure on that. Mhm.
Yeah, okay. So,
Yeah,
so
but we
anyway,
still
I'll
have time.
wait to hear from
We
other
still have,
people on the
we still
on
have
that.
time for that. I sort of jumped the gun a little bit because we were going to talk about next steps in the last 10 minutes of the meeting, and then we were going to do charter now. But I feel like, we've got momentum around sort of these two paths, and I'm just curious what people think about which one we should do next.
Okay. We'll wait and listen to what folks have to say.
Yeah, thanks though for bringing that up.
I don't have a strong preference, Jamie. It's a dealer's choice.
Yeah, and we're going to get to both. So, Greg, your hand is still up. Did you have something more to add?
No, could go either way. I didn't mean to leave my hand up. I'll take it down.
Kelly?
I guess maybe building on this one, I think I would prefer to keep the theme of the animal cruelty with that focus rather than comparing the states. Maybe that could be APHIS and their role in November's time. I don't know if I answered that. I just gave
Yeah, no, you did. I mean, I'm asking for your opinion.
Okay.
We
that would be my preference, but
yeah,
it doesn't.
Yeah, so the BMPs and Jim's presentation and Kevin and Derek's answers today were really focused on, how has trapping changed around through an animal welfare lens. What are we doing, as trappers to address those concerns? And so the other side of that conversation is the trauma side of it, the veterinarian side of it, there's another side to that. So it's continuing to look at it through an animal welfare lens and how that informs the trap check times.
Yeah, I think that's why it just continues that discussion and then it would close it. Okay.
Tyler?
Yeah, I think one definition is escaping this group so far. Can someone explain for the group what humane means to this group? Because I heard Bob say something along the lines that if we can't trap humanely, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Bob. I don't remember exactly what you said after this, but maybe we should change what we're doing or something like that to be humane. So can we get into that either at this meeting or another meeting?
And that's something that it would be good to. So after the meeting, we do a little survey to get people's input on how the meeting went. And if everybody would reply to that, we could include a question about people, how people define humane, Tyler, so that when we come back together, we can have a more common understanding, at least where everybody's at. What do you think about that, Tyler?
That's fine. I just Googled it, but maybe everybody has a different perspective on it. But
I think, that's what part of what we're trying to do is make sure that we're all using language that, we have a common understanding about how we're talking about this. That's one of the reasons why we've spent time on the BMPs. That's one of the reasons why we've sent the information out, so people had a more common understanding of what the trapping practices are currently in play. So are there other thoughts about, which one? We heard from Kelly, we heard from Marianne, and a couple others saying, you choose, doesn't matter. Okay, well, we'll go ahead. We had planned to have the animal welfare conversation more complete today. So I think we can talk about this today as part one, and then part two will be our next meeting. And then for sure, Kevin, we're going to follow up with you and Derek and others about the next conversation in November, which is really around how APHIS is responding to different trap check times in different states with similar geographies, and what the resources are in those states, and how, what we need to be learning from that in terms of the ability to check traps more frequently and or have more robust partnerships with landowners and or whatever. Applying other tools. So there's a piece of work there that we need to work on to tee up. that sound good? Okay, Sam just messaged me about, she said, what about a subgroup for that? I think that it's, so we're going to meet with Shannon and Derek and Kevin and ODFW staff. So we'll talk about this topic there. And then Kevin C, we'll definitely follow up with you. And if there are other people you want to bring in around that, we'll talk about it and figure out how best to put that together. So it's less presentation heavy and more conversational. That would be great. Okay. So with that, let's go ahead and move to, so we have our next 2 meetings set up. That's awesome. Jim, thank you for your presentation today and everybody's frank conversation about it. Kevin, thanks for being off the cuff, and Derek, you too. And so if we can move to the charter, there's 2 things. I know it's unbelievable. We've looked at this charter every meeting, but there's only 2 things left. One is this question that came up last time about game animals being included. And we promised you that we would sit down with the commissioners, and we sat down with them and Shannon and talked about this. And if I am reflecting this accurately, Jill and Greg and Shannon, where we landed is that this group was going to focus on furbearers and predator classifications. This group may recommend that there's a different collection of people that look at the game animals interface with this, but that we wouldn't be including game animals as a part of this conversation right now. Greg, Jill, did I capture that right? Shannon? I see Jill put her thumbs up. Any nuance, Greg or Shannon, you want to add to that or change?
And so how does the, one of the species that came into question was bear. And so just remind me again what category we're putting bear in?
Game.
Jill, is that where we landed? That they were not?
That's what I recall, that we were, it doesn't mean that we're not going to talk about it in the future, but for this group, that brings in the category of game animals. And we're certainly willing to talk about it, but in another group, because we'd be needing to bring in the forest industry and a whole lot of other players that we don't have yet, and we kind of be starting the process all over again.
Okay, I remember that. I remember also just, we were talking about that animal suffering is animal suffering regardless of the animal. But maybe that we need to narrow this a little bit more, but acknowledging that those are animals that we're considering that suffer as well, that are trapped.
Yeah, we did talk about that, Greg, and that's where the animal welfare sort of lens came out for this conversation today, and the one we're going to do at our next meeting. And so, they're definitely, I think, like Jill said, I mean, it's there could be learnings from these conversations that could apply to bear, but in terms of consciously saying yes, bear and other game animals are a part of this conversation. What we talked about with Shannon, I saw Shannon nod her head yes, is that we need a slightly different collection of people to have that discussion.
Right. I remember, Shannon, you were bringing up a kind of an odd contradiction or a loophole in the statute that we needed to discuss as well, related to predators. And so you remember that better than I do, probably.
I have written down that we're looking at a phased approach. So we deal with this, we have this group, and then we can move into another group later on.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I just want Shannon to, there was a nuance that we needed to clarify. And I don't recall, I'd have to go back through my notes again, but we can circle back to that.
Shannon, do you know what Greg's referring to?
I think I do. Sorry, I didn't weigh in earlier. We've talked about Furbear definitions, and we've talked about predatory animal definitions. There is another statute, 498012, that covers the taking of wildlife causing damage, and it specifically mentions cougar, bobcat, red fox, and bear. And so they're treated a little bit differently. And then in addition, as has already been mentioned, cougar and so bobcat and fox fall under Furbear, and cougar and bear fall under game animals. And then there's management plans associated with them. And so it's kind of uniquely different. You would have a different statutory construction for them. You have different set of regulations that cover how they can be hunted or trapped. And it was really, kicked around. There's good arguments for both, including it or not. But at the end of the day, it looked like it was uniquely enough. We could discuss it, but maybe narrow the focus of the scope to predatory and Furbear. That makes
Right.
sense?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that, Shannon.
So is there any more conversation about this? People have questions. Oh, a couple hands up. Tyler and then Quinn.
Yeah, so we just added in a phased approach, and that was discussed by commissioners. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit rummy maybe, but maybe I wasn't following all of that. And then other wildlife groupings was deleted. I'm a little bit confused as to what's going on my screen.
Sam, what are you doing with our screen?
Yeah, I was trying to capture the commissioner's comment. I can just get rid of that if that is helpful.
Yeah, I think that conversation about a future process would be a part of the recommendations of this group if they wanted to recommend that. Does that clarify it, Tyler?
Yeah, I think the way it's written right now, the work group will focus on identifying and addressing any issues relating to trap tech time intervals for Furbearers and predatory classifications, I think is where we would prefer it be, we being OHA.
Quinn, your hand is up.
Yeah, so I have two questions for ODFW. The first is, does the commission have the authority to change by rule the trap check time intervals for Furbearers? And the exact same question for animals classified as predatory animals under ORS 610.
The answer to both of those questions is yes. We have those regulations in place to date that are established by our commission. So yes.
Okay, and then Derek, is that true even for Furbearers that are established by statute?
Yeah, it's ratified in rule at 48 hours.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and that's the last meeting that I was referring to. That's where we landed with the 48 hours.
Okay, Sam, is there one other thing in the charter that we need to look at?
Yeah, it was around the public input component.
Way at the bottom.
Yeah, not that far.
Not that far. The group may consider future meetings to solicit public input. You want to highlight that sentence, please, so people can find it on their screen. So the question is, do we want that to be included? There was a question about that. It was an addition. Any thoughts? I mean, it's pretty good. We only had two things on this whole, and then we can put it to bed. We don't have to look at it again. Marianne?
I guess my question is, assuming that there's so assume there's requirements that relate to racks, and I don't know if the department would intend for, even though I know they'd have to actually draft rules and go through a rulemaking process if there were changes to rules proposed, would the department have a separate rack there that would have a separate public comment period, because racks have to have public comment periods attached to them, et cetera. Or would they say that this process supplants the need for a RAC, in which case I would suggest that this process be run as close to a RAC as possible, which would include public comment opportunities at the end. So that's maybe a department question of if there are rule changes recommended, would they convene a separate RAC and undergo a separate decision process, or would they jump right into putting those rules out for public comment? In which case, I think this group needs to run closer to RAC process.
Yeah, to answer Mary Ann's question, which is it, this is how we envision it. We can discuss this, but it was the latter of what you described, Mary Ann, which is basically this process would develop our ideas of what changes we would recommend to the commission. We would open up rulemaking. There'd be a report out of outcomes from this work group as part of that. And then we would have the rulemaking open for 60 days with a commission decision at the end through the public commission meeting process. Wondering if I was on mute.
No, you were not. We all heard you. I think people are just taking it in, being quiet. Mary Ann, you're unmuted. Is there something you wanted to add?
Oh, I thought about it, but then I couldn't formulate the words, so I just sat here off mute. Yeah, because I mean, in that case, I don't think we need to worry about kind of the public process element of it. But again, I just feel like transparency is best, and it you know, I do think it would be good for the RAC, like a RAC does, for the group to maybe hear comments from the public at the end of a meeting, or have at least one meeting where the public can comment. Because I do, like, for example, I know I have members that are watching each of these meetings and would like the opportunity to weigh in before they feel like decisions are made. So I like public process, so I feel like I might slow things down sometimes with that too. So y'all's call.
Anybody else want to weigh in on whether or not we keep this sentence in? I mean, it says may, you may consider, so it kind of keeps the door open. Jim?
Yeah, I'd like to get rid of that sentence myself. I'm getting a little tired of all these meetings. I mean, Stan and I are the only ones on these groups.
That's how you really feel, Jim.
Okay. We don't get paid for anything that we do on these groups. Most of these people on this group are being paid for what they do in one fashion or another. It just costs me time and money, and the less meetings, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I appreciate the not getting paid part, Jim. I wasn't referring to you, Greg. But I also appreciate, as Mary Ann said, it as transparent as possible, the public process. And we can leave the word may in, and we can decide at the end.
Yeah,
but
that's what I was kind of thinking.
I feel the public would probably want to have some input, when we're done with this, especially the ones that have been following this along for months.
Jill? Jill, you're muted.
I second what Greg said, and Mary Ann, that I think the more transparent we can be, but definitely leave the may not required. But I've heard from various members of the public who do want to at least give comment, not as the group that is here making their decisions, but as either support or whatever. So I think it's worth leaving it in. And I'm not paid either.
It seems like the may gives you some discretion. Tyler?
Yeah, am in favor of keeping it in just because it does say may, and we can decide that. And remembering that ODFW staff will be making the recommendation to the commission, I think it's perfectly viable that the public be able to provide input to ODFW staff through this process also.
Okay, bye, Bob. Bob needed to leave. All right, well, we are right at 4 o'clock. So we know what we're doing for our next meeting. Our next meeting is on, when's our next meeting, Sam?
October 5th, sorry.
October 5th, thanks. I was thinking the 29th, but that's fever. So October 5th is our next meeting. We'll continue to work with the little group of folks to tee up that agenda for that meeting. And we'll work with a small group of folks to tee up the agenda for the November meeting. And certainly, you know, as many of you know, Sam and I are available for you to call and talk to. And I think we've met with every single one of you at least once in between meetings. So if not multiple times, and we're happy to do that. So don't hesitate to give us a call. Thanks for everybody's good contributions today. I think we were successful in having one topic, and thank you, Tyler, for reminding us that that's how we'll have good productive meetings. Everybody have a good rest of your afternoon.